Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 8. It's about civil liberties. This is Lesson 9 about limits on religion. In this lesson, you'll learn about the United States Supreme Court case of Wisconsin versus Yoder, the United States Supreme Court case of Thomas versus Indiana, the United States Supreme Court case of Oregon versus Smith, about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the United States Supreme Court case of Burney versus Flores. In a previous lesson, we learned that civil liberties are not absolute. There might be some point beyond which your freedom goes too far, and the government can step in and stop you from exercising it. We learned that it's the United States Supreme Court that decides where that line is, where you've taken your freedoms too far. We learned that the Supreme Court claims that they have a system for deciding where that line is. They first of all decide whether or not the freedom in question, the civil liberty, is what they call a fundamental freedom or a non-fundamental freedom. If it's a fundamental freedom, one of those things that's important to us just being a free people and a free society, then the government must have a compelling interest in order to take that freedom away from someone. On the other hand, if it's a non-fundamental freedom, then the government only needs a rational basis, just a logical excuse to do whatever they do that's infringing upon that freedom. Through this system, the United States Supreme Court can effectively create, define, or even destroy constitutional rights by deciding whether or not they're fundamental or not fundamental, whether the government has a compelling reason or it doesn't, etc. In this lesson, we're going to look at the example of the court doing this as we examine cases where they are applying the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. Now, if you were to ask most people whether or not the free exercise of religion is a fundamental freedom or not, they would probably say that it is. It's listed in the First Amendment along with such things as freedom of speech and freedom of the press, which are sort of universally viewed as fundamental freedoms also. So I think most people would say, yeah, free exercise of religion is a fundamental freedom too. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Supreme Court sees it that way. In the United States Supreme Court case of Wisconsin versus Yoder, they had a situation where some members of the Amish faith living in Wisconsin had children who had reached high school age, and they decided not to send them to school anymore. The reason is because their religion tries to separate themselves from worldly things that can distract from their faith. And while they were okay with their children, for example, going to elementary school to learn to read and write, they had a problem with their kids going to high school where they might be influenced by social things that their religion considers to be inappropriate. So they kept their kids home from school, and the state ended up prosecuting them for not sending their kids to public school as was required. Well, the Supreme Court ended up deciding that in order for Wisconsin to infringe upon the religious freedom of the Yoders and force them to send their children to school, the state of Wisconsin would need a compelling reason to do so. And the reasons that were offered by the state were considered to not be sufficiently compelling. The state said that they had to send them to school so they'd learn a trade and they'd become good citizens, etc. And the court said, well, Amish kids really learn a lot about earning a living on a farm, and they're all pretty much good citizens, so I guess they don't need to go to school for those things. So the parents won. But the important thing about this case for this lesson is that the Supreme Court applied a compelling interest test. So yes, they said that religious freedom is a fundamental freedom, requiring the highest order of protection as the court examines whether or not the government can infringe upon it. Now let's look at another case, Thomas versus Indiana. In this case, there was a man, a Jehovah's Witness, who as part of his religion was a pacifist. Now what this means is he didn't believe in war, didn't want to do anything to participate in war either. Well, he had a job at a factory where he helped make sheet metal. And that was okay. He made the sheet metal and it was used for a lot of different things. Then they shut down that part of the factory and transferred him over to another part where they would build parts for tanks. Well, he decided to quit that job. And because he was building instruments of war, he was a pacifist, he didn't believe in war as part of his religion, so he quit the job, and then he applied for unemployment benefits, and they were denied him because of him quitting his job. Well, he went to court, and basically the argument he made is the state of Indiana is punishing me for living my religion, while somebody else who for some reason ends up out of work can get unemployment. I can't, and the reason is simply because I'm out of work because of my religion. So they're punishing me for my religious beliefs. Now, whether you agree with that argument or not, that's the argument he made. And how did the Supreme Court treat it? Well, they said what is at issue here is a fundamental freedom. The freedom of him being able to exercise his religion, which includes trying to avoid things that have to do with war. So, for Indiana to infringe upon that religion, which the Supreme Court said they effectively were by trying to force him to make a choice between living his religion or getting the money from the government, they said if they are infringing upon his ability to live his religion, they would need a compelling reason to do so, which in the end they decided they didn't, and Thomas got his benefits. Now, the point of this case isn't so much to think about whether or not he should have got his benefits. The point of this case is to recognize that the Supreme Court again applied the compelling interest standard in evaluating a case concerning religious freedom. But then a few years later, another case came to the Supreme Court. Now remember, we have at least two precedents here, and there are others, that said that the free exercise of religion is a fundamental freedom that requires a compelling interest for the government to infringe upon it. But then this case comes in 1990 in the state of Oregon, where there are a couple of guys who are drug rehab counselors. And as part of being a drug rehab counselor, they have to be tested for drugs, and they failed the tests and were fired. They then applied for unemployment benefits, and the unemployment benefits were denied to them because they were fired for violating a state law. Well, they said, well, wait a minute. The only reason that we were caught violating that state law, taking those drugs that we were told we shouldn't, is because we were practicing our religion. See, they said, we're members of the Native American Church. They were Native Americans, and it's a practice among many American Indian tribes to ingest hallucinogenic drugs that enable them, as part of their religious ceremonies, to have hallucinations, what an outsider might call hallucinations, but what they thought of as religious visions. This was a deeply important part of their faith. It wasn't something they just made up to try to get away with something here, but it was really a traditional part of their sincere religion. Well, when the Supreme Court got the case, rather than applying the compelling interest standard as they had in Yoder and Thomas, in this Oregon versus Smith case, and they instead said that Oregon only needs a valid and neutral reason to deprive Smith of the unemployment benefits that he was seeking. Now think about what that means, a valid and neutral reason. Does that sound like a compelling interest? No, it certainly doesn't. It sounds like a rational basis. So effectively in this case, the Supreme Court reduced religious freedom protection from the level of compelling interest down to the level of rational basis. What that basically means is that the government can come along and take your religious freedom away from you so long as they have a rational reason to do so. So, what the Supreme Court does currently is they treat the free exercise of religion as a non-fundamental freedom. Well, after this decision was issued in Oregon versus Smith, it caused a backlash across the country. Many people were upset about it. Couldn't believe that the Supreme Court was treating people's religious faith as not fundamental. Well, the way the Supreme Court was actually able to do this in the case of Oregon versus Smith, because it was a state-level case, was through the doctrine of selective incorporation, which has been explained previously in this unit. Remember, through the doctrine of selective incorporation, a state is required to live up to some right in the Bill of Rights by the Supreme Court reading that right into the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So what they're really evaluating when they do a case like this is whether or not the state of Oregon, for example, has violated the 14th Amendment. Well, there's another section of the 14th Amendment besides the Due Process Clause. It's Section 5. And there it says that Congress will have power to enforce that amendment by appropriate legislation. So after the Oregon versus Smith case, Congress didn't like what the Supreme Court had done. So they invoked their Section 5 powers here from the 14th Amendment, and they passed a law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. What that law did was it tried to force the courts to once again use the compelling interest standard when evaluating whether or not the government could infringe upon somebody's religious beliefs. So basically what they said was, we're in charge of enforcing this amendment, and here's how we want it enforced. Nobody's religious freedom can be taken away under the selective incorporation doctrine, which the Supreme Court claims is part of the 14th Amendment, unless they have a compelling reason to do so. That's what Congress tried to require. Well, a case then ended up at the Supreme Court, where this power under the Fifth Amendment of Congress, under the 14th Amendment, Section 5, was an issue for the court. They had to decide, can Congress really require courts to use a compelling interest test or not? Well, in this case, the case of Bernie versus Flores, and yes, that's how they pronounce the name of their city down there in Texas. Looks like Bourne to me, but they say Bernie. In this case of Bernie versus Flores, the Supreme Court said, you know what? Congress can't require us to use the compelling interest test. It's not their job to tell us how to interpret the Constitution. It's our job. And we are not going to listen to Congress here. We are going to continue to apply the rational basis standards to cases like this. Now, specifically what this case involved was there was a church there in the city of Bernie whose whose congregation had grown enough that the church had become too small. And so they decided that they needed to expand their church. The problem was the city of Bernie had designated their church as a historical landmark, and they denied them the building permit. So the church sued and said, hey, we should be able to expand our building if we want to. That's religious freedom. How dare the city tell us that we can't enlarge our congregation? So with the decision in this case at the Supreme Court, the congregation lost. The city won. They were able to force the church to maintain its same size, and they merely had to show a rational reason for doing so, which was, this is a historical building, we need to preserve it for other people without it being altered by an expansion plan, and the city wins. So the important thing to recognize from this is that the Supreme Court at one point had said that religious freedom is protected at the compelling interest level, which I think most Americans would agree with if they understood these Supreme Court tests. But for the last couple of decades, they've said, no, it's at the rational basis level, which means that the government can take your religious freedoms away from you, so long as they have a rational reason to do so. So at least arguably then, what the Supreme Court has effectively done with these cases is destroy people's free exercise of religion. Their free exercise of religion exists at the pleasure of the government. If the government happens to want them to exercise their religion that way, they leave them alone. If not, they pass some generally applicable law that says that kind of thing can't be done anymore, and then they are no longer allowed to do it, as long as there's a rational basis for it, which is a very easy hurdle for the state to get over. So as a real-world example of this thing, let's say a state passes a law and says nobody can perform a marriage in this state unless they are also willing to marry same-sex couples. And then you have a pastor at a church that doesn't believe in same-sex marriage is now required to perform same-sex marriages, unless he just wants to get out of the marriage business altogether. Well, if he went to court and the court would say, well, I'm sorry, but the standard to be applied here is not compelling interest, it's rational basis. We just simply ask whether the government has a rational reason for trying to force everybody in that state to perform marriages for same-sex couples, and they'd probably bring up something about treating people equally, and the government would win. And the minister would be forced to then perform same-sex marriages or just stop performing marriages at all. All right, so now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What was required to force Amish kids to attend high school? Was it rational basis, heightened interest, important interest, or compelling interest? In that case, the Supreme Court required a compelling interest. What was required to deny benefits to religious pacifists in the case of Thomas versus Indiana? Was it a rational basis, a heightened interest, an important interest, or a compelling interest? It was a compelling interest because they were treating this pacifist religious convictions as a fundamental freedom. What was required to deny benefits, unemployment benefits, to religious drug users? Like in the case of Oregon versus Smith. Rational basis, heightened interest, important interest, or compelling interest? In the Oregon versus Smith case, only a rational basis was then required. So the test used to decide whether or not somebody's religious freedoms were being infringed on was lowered by the court from the fundamental freedom compelling interest level to the non-fundamental freedom rational basis level, and that's where it's been since. What did RFRA try to do? Now, RFRA is the abbreviation we use for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Did it try to tax churches? Did it try to establish official churches? Did it separate church and state? Or did it require the compelling interest test? The Religious Freedom Restoration Act tried to require the compelling interest test. What was the free exercise test that was used after the Bernie case? Was it rational basis, heightened interest, important interest, or compelling interest? The free exercise test used after the Bernie case was rational basis. Okay, that completes our review and completes our lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 8. It will be Lesson 10 about due process of law.